and welcome to the I T'd Myself podcast. My name is Matthew Miniman, and this is episode 20, Deep Dive, Networking 2, Firewalls. So, if you survived the first networking deep dive, which conceivably you did because you're listening to this episode, you can understand that networking is complex. It can have a lot of different pieces. It can have a lot of different aspects to it that make it difficult, that you have to understand. And so what we're going to do in this episode is we're going to focus on one of the more complex aspects of networking, one of the direct things that all organizations should have in their network, and some of the things that you guys probably don't even realize, if you're not IT people, some of the things that you don't even realize may be running on your systems or in your networks as it is. So, firewalls. Firewalls come in a lot of different sizes. If you search for types of firewalls, you'll get a lot of different answers. There's like the 3 different types of firewalls, the 8 different types of firewalls, the 5 different types of firewalls, the 7 different types of firewalls. Suffice it to say, there are a lot of different ways to identify firewalls. There are a lot of different ways to divide firewalls. And the primary aspect of what you need to understand is that firewalls are what control communication on a specific type of device or network group of devices, and how it communicates to another device, type of device, or network. And so when we say firewall, typically what we mean is the firewall on the edge. This is an edge firewall. This is the thing that sits between your network and the internet. That is typically what we refer to as a firewall. But there are other firewalls. There's a software firewall that's typically installed directly on your computer. Windows comes with it, as well as all Linux. It's called uncomplicated firewall. It's typically installed by default on all Linux distributions or something like it. There are web application firewalls, which control communication to and from a web application. And then there are a bunch of other different types of firewalls, proxy firewalls, next-gen firewalls, blah, blah, blah. The entire point here is that there are a lot of different firewalls, but when we primarily talk about firewalls, when we talk about firewalls in the abstract, typically what we mean is controlling communication from an interior network to the greater internet. A firewall, a good example of a firewall, simple and probably doing a lot more than you think it should be, is your home firewall, your router that you have on your home internet could also be considered a firewall because it controls the communication of traffic from the internal network to the exterior and blocks traffic from reaching in. And so to dive a little deeper into firewalls and exactly what they are and exactly how they work, you have to understand that those different types of firewalls exist. And so the first type that we're going to cover is kind of the basic firewall, the edge firewall that we talk about in the abstract. So a regular firewall that you have, one that operates on your router, or if you're a business, or hopefully your business that's running normally, an actual firewall such as SonicWall or FortiGate or Palo Alto or something like that you've probably, if you've been in the industry or you've been looking for a firewall, you've probably heard those names spouted pretty often. But those firewalls operate where they take all traffic in and they feed it to the internet, and then they filter all traffic coming from the internet, and they block everything except for what's allowed. So by default, there are 2 configurations that are installed on firewalls, and those 2 configurations are allow out everything. Allow everything, all communication out. So I, as a computer communicating with the internet, can reach out to everywhere and anything I want to. But the second rule is block anything coming in. And so any device that attempts to connect from outside of the network and attempts to reach into any specific device internally is blocked. Now, what this means is that your traffic flows really in only one direction. Your traffic flows out. But if you're thinking about traffic flowing in such a way that it's like a highway, you're probably like, wait a minute. Well, then how do I receive any of the information out? If I'm only sending stuff out, how do I get stuff back in? And that's because the internet traffic does not work like a highway or a car system. It kind of works like conversation. I can initiate a conversation with somebody else. And when I've initiated that conversation, I am now creating a session where we can talk back and forth. We typically only talk back and forth over a single channel, but this is what is called a session. And that is how a firewall is supposed to work. It's supposed to allow that session through. And so the information can flow both ways. Now, you can configure firewalls to allow any sorts of traffic in any sorts of ways. There's a lot of different methods of allowing traffic through and allowing traffic to communicate. But typically the way it works is that when you have a firewall, you are blocking all that traffic that's coming in except for what you want. Now, this is where you get a lot of shit that fucks with your network. Namely, like if you have a basic firewall, something like a router, Netgear, or a router that's provided to you by your internet service provider, your ISP, Comcast, CenturyLink, Cox, whoever's providing you with your network or your internet rather. If you're using one of their routers, those are cheap. Those are inexpensive routers, and they come with certain features to try to make it easier for normal people who aren't IT people to use. And one of those features is called Universal Plug and Play, UPnP. You might have heard of it. UPnP, what this does is it automatically opens ports on the firewall to communicate directly to specific devices. This is where those simple firewalls from these specific companies get people into trouble, because Universal Plug and Play is insecure. And so what it does, there was a case, and this may still be happening, I don't remember, but there were printers where if you plug them into your network and you just said yes to everything as the pop-ups came, just because you wanted to configure the fucking printer and get it to work, because printers have enough problems of their own. I should really do an episode on printers. You probably didn't notice that one of the questions that it asked was, do you want to enable Universal Plug and Play? And Universal Plug and Play opens up those insecure ports for this printer, and then this printer is exposed directly out to the internet. It was something in like 2012. There was an attack that there was an attack that was perpetrated by this one dude. He found a bunch of these printers that were exposed to the internet, and he sent this meme out. It was something like "Vote for PewDiePie," who was a YouTuber at the time, but it was basically a notification that your printer could be reachable and printed to from the internet. And he did this across a ton of organizations, and it hit a lot of people. It hit restaurants, it hit banks, it hit government organizations. Anybody who had Universal Plug and Play enabled basically had their printer exposed, and this dude could print to it. Now, you as a normal person might not think that's such a terrible thing. Yeah, you waste some ink, but it's not really that big of a deal. But think about the fact that if your printer's exposed and I can print to it, I can probably also do a lot of other things to it, meaning things like take it over and use it as a zombie to then perform attacks against either yourself internally to your network or to the greater world. And so it's a risk that shouldn't exist. And that's what Universal Plug and Play does from a specific standpoint. But the reason why I bring that up is that those configurations on those basic firewalls can lead to an insecure configuration. Most of the time, you don't want to expose a lot of stuff to the internet. You only want to expose some individual pieces to the internet. And so what you do is you configure what is called port forwarding, which is one of the things that most firewalls do. Port forwarding basically is telling the firewall, I want this to communicate out on this port. And if you scroll back to the episode 1 of Networking Deep Dive, ports are how we communicate. And we'll actually do a whole deep dive on what a lot of the popular ports are, because that's important for a lot of people for certification tests. And we'll go over that. And hopefully people don't kill themselves and listen to it, because I would feel bad. But port forwarding allows you to communicate directly out to the internet and expose that information out. So like if you're hosting a website off of a web server, you would push that website by port forwarding the port that the website is hosted on to the external IP address of your network, and then people could reach your website. And that's kind of how the whole port forwarding works. There's more complicated things to it, but for the purposes of this episode, we're really gonna focus, or for right now, we're gonna focus on that. Is that port forwarding involves you pushing ports out from one specific thing to the exterior of whatever you're working on. And like I said, firewalls in the abstract, all firewalls kind of operate in the same way. You have this port that you want to expose, and you expose it out, and depending on the IP address, whether it be internal or external, and when we say external IP address, we're talking about the IP address that is broadcasted outward to the greater network or greater internet. And when we say internal IP address, we mean whatever's private to that specific device or specific network. Again, you kind of have to think of this in layers. It's all networking. It's fucking layers. Too many onions. So as you decide what you want to expose to the internet, you're going to have a lot of different rules that you might want to put in place, such as you might want to have a specific configuration where if a specific type of device attempts to connect to your network, it does this one thing, or if a specific device attempts to connect to this specific address or this specific URL on your network, it does this other thing. And that's where those web application firewalls, proxy firewalls, all sort of come into play. And we'll cover those here in just a little bit. But so on the greater abstract firewall piece, another thing that you can have is packet filtering, and this is looking at basically the state of a communication or state of a session, and identifying traffic as it comes in and doing specific things with it. And so you can have these way back when you could have called these stateful firewalls, where they are basically looking at all traffic coming in and out. It's not just filtering the traffic based on where it's going. It's also looking at the traffic and figuring out what it's trying to do, and then performing functions on that. And so you can have specific rules set in place to filter traffic even further within your network. And these are what are called network access translation, and NAT for short. And NAT rules allow you to basically define specific rules on how data flows within the network and then outside of the network. And so you can have some really complicated configuration setups. You can have multiple networks, multiple types of networks, all configured in such a way that traffic flows in a specific pattern. And so you keep your stuff kind of isolated. In a network, if you're hosting stuff out to the internet, and the most secure configuration you can have is you can have what is called the demilitarized zone, DMZ. And a DMZ in networking is kind of this isolated network that has very specific rules on how it can communicate in and out. But it's where you would set like a web server. And the reason why you set up DMZ is so that if your web server or whatever server you're exposing out to the internet is compromised, it doesn't affect the rest of your network. And so what you do is you set up a network access translation rule that sets up this DMZ that then allows communication into the firewall, or into the web server from your firewall, and then from your web server to whatever other internal servers that it might need to communicate for additional information. Because all computer, you don't have everything on your web server. You have a SQL server that's isolated away from it. You've got an application server that might be isolated away from it. You might have other, servers that are performing activity behind it that need to communicate back to the web server for data. And so you have all of these network access you have all these net rules that identify the information and translate appropriately and basically route it. It's different than routing, but basically push the data and communication in a very specific path. And so when you are running a web server and you have this isolated network, this DMZ, your communication comes into the DMZ and hits the web server, and then there are additional rules that then communicate out directly into the internet, and directly into your internal network. And that is something that should be remembered. And if you're designing a network, or if you're coming into IT, you need to understand that you're basically trying to limit the exposure that you're putting to your stuff. Anything you're pushing out to the internet should be isolated away from your greater network, which is why that universal plug and play is so dangerous, because universal plug and play doesn't create a DMZ for those devices. It just exposes those devices that are sitting on the same level of your network as everything else. And so your Xbox is creating problems for your network. So that's kind of the basic operation of network. Now of a firewall. Now I'm talking about other different types of other firewalls. There are what are called next generation firewalls, and next generation firewalls are not what they sound like. It is not, like next generation consoles where it's the latest and greatest console. Next generation firewalls are probably more commonplace now than any other type of firewall, because when we're talking about firewalls in the abstract, that's really kind of what we're talking about. Those Sophoses, those Firewallas, those Unified Dream Machines, those Palo Altos, SonicWalls, FortiGates, all of them are basically next generation firewalls. They do a lot of different things. They do the packet filtering. They do the NAT rules. They do things that are called deep packet inspection. Deep packet inspection is where every piece of communication is identified and analyzed through the communication. And in fact, you can then have something called SSL intercept, which allows communication to be decrypted as it's pushed. So that way your firewall is looking at all traffic and identifying anything that might be malicious, even if it's encrypted. You also have things like NIDS and NIPS, IPS, intrusion prevention or intrusion detection systems. And basically this is a fancy way of saying that these detect malicious activity within the network and then prevent the activity from occurring. So if a malicious attack is occurring on your network, it can identify it and stop that communication. A lot of IPS works off of concepts known as bot lists or blacklists, where you have these known attack addresses or known attack indicators of compromise, and when they match, it stops the connection as it sees it. And so next generation firewalls do a lot, and they are just basically when we talk about those firewalls in the abstract, and we're talking about firewalls that sit on your edge, that's typically what we're talking about. Now, firewalls if you are operating in a business, an enterprise, an organization that makes money or depends on money, and you need to secure your data, you should not be using a consumer firewall. You should not be using a Netgear or a Nighthawk or a D-Link or any of those routers that you can buy from Best Buy or Office Depot. You should not be using those routers. Do not use them. Throw them in the trash. Get rid of them. Hire an IT person, please, for the love of God. The reason why is because, as I said before with Universal Plug and Play, these types of routers are configured in such a way to make it easy for use, which means they are insecure. You can think of easy to use as insecure. Security is all about security over convenience. And these firewalls sacrifice security for convenience. And there have been multiple, just absolutely a shit ton of vulnerabilities that have been exposed off of these consumer firewalls. And if you use a firewall or a router or whatever that was provided to you by your ISP, throw it the fuck away, because you are allowing that ISP control over your internal network, which is just fucking awful. There has been a case here over the last 3 years where Comcast specifically has disabled or prevented RDP out from internal networks, and it has been a disaster for a lot of clients of mine because they use RDP to communicate to their servers. And as insecure as you might think that is, it's not your fucking responsibility to tell my business what I can do, what I can and cannot do. Anyways, the point being here is that your firewall should be an enterprise level firewall. You can make yourself an enterprise level firewall if you really want. There's a lot of different open source firewalls that are free. As long as you have hardware, you can install them. And there's things like pfSense, OpenSense, Open Firewall. There's a lot of different ways to do this. If you have the gumption and you are a creative enough of a person and you have the ability and the technical know-how, you can create your own firewall off of a Linux server and using UFW. Hell, you could make a firewall out of a Windows machine if you have enough know-how. But the point I'm trying to make is if you have a firewall that is provided to you, that is cheap, that is consumer level firewall, and you're running an organization, you need to get rid of it and actually buy yourself an enterprise level firewall. Spend the extra money because it's going to be worth it. You're going to be able to control the traffic that's going into your network, which is really what you should be concentrating on, is controlling the traffic into your network. Now, controlling the traffic out is a whole other story, and a lot of the more complicated, more robust firewalls can do that. You should be concerned with making sure that you don't have data egress to command and control servers. But really, if your firewall is exposed and it can be exploited and is just this cheap piece of shit that you bought from Best Buy, I know Nighthawks are like $1,000, but if you're just buying one of these motherfuckers and you think that's good enough for your enterprise, you are wrong, and you are going to pay the price. It is going to cost you in time, money, and in the case of certain health organizations, it might cost lives. So please, for the love of God, use an enterprise level firewall if you are operating an enterprise. It doesn't have to be an expensive one. Fuck. The SonicWall has firewalls for like $600, which is at least $400 cheaper than a Nighthawk. So go out and get one of them. Anyways, I'm going to step off my soapbox there for a bit because I can talk all day about how shitty that your firewalls are. Anyway, on the concept of firewalls, software firewalls that we talk about typically are what are installed alongside the operating system. And again, these are things like uncomplicated firewall for Linux and the Windows firewall on a Windows machine. And these operate just like the greater firewalls in the abstract, but these operate on a concept of that they are completely based on software. There is no hardware component that is limiting the traffic flow. Now, if you install the specific types of antivirus or anti-malware solutions, they may also come with a firewall solution alongside them. So things like Bitdefender inject a driver into your network device, your network card, and it can control communication into and out of your computer, much like your Windows firewall. Now, that's a lot more complicated than I want to get into right now, but basically, suffice it to say that the Windows firewall, or the uncomplicated firewall, controls traffic just like a regular firewall does, but it does it at the software level, at the OS level. And so what this means is that intrinsically, the data that flows into your computer hits the firewall first and then is communicated through whatever rules you might have. And really, the software firewalls are pretty basic in that they either allow or they don't. They don't do a whole lot else. They either allow the traffic in or they don't allow the traffic in. Now, they can direct specific traffic to specific programs or processes that exist on a machine, but generally, if the traffic's coming in, it's just going to allow it to come in, and then you have to kind of figure out. The computer has to kind of figure out what is going to communicate, what that traffic's going to communicate to. Proxy firewalls or proxies are basically configuring how traffic flows in and out of a network from the or in and out of a specific device to the internet, in and out of a network. So proxies basically work in such a way that if you're using a proxy, you are communicating to the internet, and the internet sees the communication coming from the proxy. It sees that traffic flowing from the proxy, and it doesn't see your information. So it's a way to anonymize your traffic. And this is kind of how all VPNs work in a way, is that all consumer VPNs work in a way. So if you're like Nord or Express or Open or VPN or private internet access, it is kind of a proxy where it's forwarding your network traffic so that it anonymizes it. Now, there's a lot more to those other VPNs, but think about a proxy as basically, this is where my internet traffic's coming out of. But on the other side, if you have a proxy that's coming in, you can also drive the data so that there's only one ingress point for all of your communication. And so this is how we handle things like having multiple web servers on a single IP address, or having multiple web servers on a single URL. So what this proxy will do is it can take the traffic that's coming in and it can identify what type of data, where the communication is supposed to go based on specific characteristics of the request. And so like if I'm requesting a specific web page from a website, I'm going to go through a different path than if I request another one. And so like if I go to index.html, it might drive me to one specific web server. Whereas if I access hotdog.html, it'll drive me to a different web server. And so that's kind of how proxies work, is it can drive your traffic based on specific rules that you set up. And proxies can be set up on really almost any web server. Nginx, Apache, IIS all have the capacity to do this. The configuration can be complex and different, but I suggest if you're interested in learning about proxies and how to set them up, one of the best ways to do it is actually to ask ChatGPT, ask AI, because it can give you some pretty good configurations out of the box that you can play with and then manipulate and learn from there. Anyways, that's what proxies, web proxies are. And it can be considered a different type of firewall because it is controlling traffic in and out of a network. Now, there are a dozen other different aspects or different types of firewalls, and there can be dozens, like I said, depending on how you've decided to separate them and divide and subdivide firewalls. But suffice to say, again, that firewalls are basically, at their basic point, controlling traffic in and out. They control how traffic flows. You can block certain things. You can allow certain things. One aspect of firewalls is called content filtration. And content filtration works on the principle of a URL has a known type of content. So if I go to Pornhub.com, obviously it's going to be porn. And hopefully your IT guy is smart enough to follow the rule that midget porn is allowed, because midget porn is always allowed. It's the only acceptable type of porn allowed in the business. But the content filtration, if I block porn, I won't be able to reach Pornhub.com. Whereas if I block news, I won't be able to reach CNN.com. I won't be able to reach AP, the Associated Press. I won't be able to reach Fox News, thank God. I won't be able to reach any of these news organizations as long as they have been categorized as news. So I'm not entirely sure if places like the InfoWars would be considered news, but it might, and so it might be blocked. And that's where you get kind of in the weeds of content filtration, is that certain websites might be miscategorized, such as Travelocity might not be travel, it might be e-commerce because you're buying stuff from them and not necessarily traveling. I don't know. That's an example, might be poor. I don't know. Anyways, so content filtration is an aspect of firewalls where it can identify the type of traffic, the type of communication that a device is attempting to reach out to, and it can block it from there. That really only comes into play with specific higher grade firewalls, although I'm sure there are some small consumer firewalls that will do that, as it's not terribly complicated to do. But you can set up content filtration in a lot of different ways. Another aspect of firewalls is you can have management networking control. Now you can do things that are called SNMP traps, and we'll go over that in a whole other separate thing, where you can identify traffic coming in, and you can forward the SNMP protocol to specific devices based on the traffic that's flowing. There's a whole lot of other ways to communicate into and out of a network using these different methods of firewalls. But possibly the most important aspect of the firewall, again, is the fact that it controls that traffic. And so if you are running a business, if you're operating a business and you are attempting to secure your network, make sure you have that edge firewall. Make sure you have something there that controls the traffic, that can identify where it's communicating, and for the love of God, make sure it's an enterprise one. If you absolutely have to, on the cheap, get one, and you don't want to spend the money, but you have hardware, go get yourself an OpenSense or pfSense ISO and install it and configure it that way. But don't fucking rely on those goddamn routers that you buy from consumer electronics stores. Don't use the shit that they give you from Comcast. It just causes issues, and it can cost your business not only in time and money, but it can cost you in reputation if your business gets compromised because you have a shitty router. Anyways, all that being said, I'm sure there is a ton more to cover on firewalls, and eventually once I get people who listen to the show who want to pick fights with me, I'm sure they'll tell me I did a horrible job and need to cover all these other billion different topics of firewalls, because fuck you, that's why. But I hope this was educational, and if you guys want to contact me, you know how. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a great day.